All right, welcome to part 2 on metamorphic rocks. As we've gone along, we've been thinking about the difference between these two rocks here. Both are metamorphic rocks. We just learned about the textural clues. In this second half, we're going to move on to compositional clues between these two rocks. That composition may tell us why one is black and one is green. All right, so we talked about naming metamorphic rocks by their textures, calling it a schist or a gneiss. But the full metamorphic rock name is going to include the metamorphic composition, so what minerals are actually in that rock. So for example, a metamorphic rock made completely of quartz. So we'll ask a side question, what protolith is completely made of all quartz? Hopefully you answered a sandstone. So a metamorphosed sandstone made completely of all quartz turns into a metamorphic rock called a quartzite because it still contains all quartz. There's nothing else in that chemical composition that could have formed new minerals. So an example of a quartzite is shown on the right here. Compared to the original sandstone, we can no longer see the individual grain boundaries. We can still see some color banding that was the original bedding layers in the sandstone. However, the grains have kind of merged now to form much more of an interlocked pattern. So if you examined this under a microscope, what you would see are these interlocked grains, such as we're viewing on the left. So there's no longer cement binding them together. These grains are now bound together by the fact that they have changed their grain boundaries under heat and under pressure to match each other. And you can tell because these are all kind of equant, they're about approximately the same length in each direction, they can't form any foliation. Another exception to some of this naming game are all limestone or all calcite rocks, which under metamorphic conditions will turn into a marble. And again, because the original limestone starts out all calcite, there is nothing else that it can really turn into. It's already kind of at its purest form. And so it remains calcite under metamorphism. This means we can't get any compositional banding, and we also don't really get any foliation. However, we can get a change in the size of the calcite. So under increasing metamorphic conditions, the calcite within a marble may grow to be larger and larger grain sizes. So these are a couple examples of that from Norway. We have a coarse-grained marble and then a pure calcite marble. So this coarse-grained marble has some color differences in it, maybe from trace amounts of other minerals, whereas this white pure calcite one has there's nothing else in it but calcite, so nothing to kind of stain the color away from its pure whiteness, which sounds weird to say that. All right, but so aside from those two exceptions, for most foliated rocks, or rocks that can gain foliation, we're going to start to add the composition to the name. So for example, in this rock on the right here, we have these elongate blue minerals in it. These elongate blue minerals are called kyanite. So a single kyanite crystal would look like this picture on the right here. It's blue, elongate, and is often described as being bladed. So what is the texture of this rock on the left? After looking at this rock, it appears to be a schist. So there is alignment of minerals. There's micas that are growing to be visible by the naked eye. In this particular photograph, it's a little bit hard to see that. If we had this in hand sample, we could turn it around and we could see those micas reflecting and flashing light at us. So it's a schist with a predominance of kyanite in it. So we call it a kyanite schist. All right, how about this rock here? We have the shimmery minerals that are micas, and we have some equant garnets. So what texture is this, and what would be the final name? Once we think you have an answer, we'll move on to call this a garnet mica schist. So the naming order goes from least to greatest abundance. At root, this is a mica schist that has been altered by some garnets. So it's a garnet mica schist. If it was mostly made of garnets with only some micas, it would be a mica garnet schist. All right. We can also use the colors to figure out something about where the rocks came from. So for example, this green rock here is a chlorite schist. So we can use this color to try and determine where it fell on that mafic-felsic scale. So if you remember from Bowen's reaction series, even if we can't identify individual minerals, we can use their general color to figure out what minerals may be present and whether we're looking at ultramafic, mafic, intermediate, or felsic rocks. So in general, we'll say that we're trying to get out protoliths from the metamorphic rocks. There's kind of an expected sequence. For example, if we start with a shale protolith, we're going to form a slate that contains a lot of clays and micas. That may metamorphose further into a schist with micas and garnets, and then into a gneiss with quartz, feldspars, biotites, and garnets. Right? So there's kind of this expected sequence based on the original chemistry of the shale. So if we see a gneiss that contains mostly quartz, feldspars, biotites, and garnets, then we know that likely came from a shale. So this rock in the upper right likely had a shale protolith. Another common protolith that we see are basalts. So if you remember, basalts are the fine-grained mafic extrusive rocks. So they're going to be made of a lot of pyroxenes, maybe some hornblende, and some calcium plagioclase. As basalts metamorphose, they tend to form a schist that may be dominant in chlorite and epidote. So these are both minerals that contain magnesium and iron, those kind of key elements of the mafic group. And those may further metamorphose into a gneiss that has olivine, pyroxene, and plagioclase. So those minerals that are at the upper part of Bowen's reaction series and are in the mafic group. And so this chlorite schist here is likely from a basalt protolith. If a sandstone metamorphoses, well, it's mostly made of quartz, so it's going to turn into a quartzite, which under increasing pressures and temperatures will remain a quartzite. So what we've seen here are a clue of how different mineral groups can be predicted from the pressure and temperature conditions and from the protolith. So as the metamorphic rate increases, different mineral groups are predicted to occur, and we call these different mineral groups facies. And that leads us to the metamorphic facies diagram. I like to think of this as a cross-section of a subduction zone. So we're essentially looking at pressure on the y-axis, and that pressure correlates with depth. So you can see on the secondary y-axis that depth increases as we move down on this diagram. So this is the top close to Earth's surface, and looking down to about 50 kilometers depth. On the x-axis is the temperature. So the temperature is going to increase towards the right. And as rocks experience increasing pressure and temperature, they're going to move down this diagram. So they start out from the 0, 0 point, where they are the original sedimentary rock. As temperatures and pressures increase, they undergo diagenesis. Right, we talked about diagenesis as that alteration that remains a sedimentary rock. It doesn't start to form new minerals quite yet. And so we can start to move through this rock or through this diagram. If the rock is subject to steadily increasing pressure that pairs with a steadily increasing temperature, so for example, regional metamorphism, it would go in a line like this. And so we would expect that to go under diagenesis to form a zeolite, then to form a green schist. So this would be a schist texture that often contains greenish minerals. Then get into a higher grade metamorphic rock called an amphibolite, and then finally into a granulite. If the original rock experienced an increase in temperature, but not in pressure, so for example, contact metamorphism, it would move this way along the diagram where we see it forming hornfels. Then finally, if we increase the pressure more rapidly than we increase the temperature, which often occurs at subduction zones, then you see we get a type of rock called a blue schist facies. So knowing the facies and knowing the protolith is going to determine the metamorphic rock that results. So to go through a couple of these, the blue schist facies, which we just mentioned, is often formed in subduction zones where the fluids that are brought down through subduction keep temperatures fairly low. These are going to be a schist that often contain a lot of blue minerals to them. So we don't find these too often because it means we have to have a subduction zone that somehow got brought back to the surface. But if we did, we would expect to find a rock that has visible micas that are foliated and that have a blue overall color to them. That may undergo increased pressures and temperatures to become an eclogite. This was one of my favorite rocks to learn about because they can also be known as Christmas tree rocks. They form under high enough pressures and temperatures that we start to get garnets in a green pyroxene forming. And so the garnets, because they're aquant, they form these sort of isolated little islands, I guess kind of like, you know, the ornaments on your Christmas tree. And then they're surrounded by this really vibrant green pyroxene mineral. And so, right, that's going to be fairly high pressures and temperatures. The typical burial path, as we mentioned before, is going to form more along this line where we go from diagenesis to a zeolite, to a green schist, to an amphibolite, to a granulite. So typically that original zeolite is going to be fairly chlorite rich. Chlorite is a green mica mineral. So like the picture of biotite earlier, you can see this chlorite forming booklets. It looks like stacked pieces of sheets of paper. And this is a particular mica that forms at low pressures and low temperatures. As that increases under pressure and temperature, we'll go into a green schist facies where we have a lot of biotite and garnet rich schists that eventually undergo another transformation to become amphibolite facies where minerals such as starlite and kyanite appear. So we'll just back up. In green schist, we would expect to see biotite, so those platy dark micas, and garnets, which are often purple red. And then at the amphibolite facies, the chemical elements within there will start to rearrange into new minerals such as starlite, which is known for having this crossed pattern to it. So you'll often have those two minerals crossing each other. And I keep looking around because I have a hand sample of this and I don't know if it's within reach. I don't think it's within reach. But these are some of the coolest ones I think to find because you just see minerals that are crossed like this. And then those are often paired with kyanites, which is that blue bladed mineral. And then as we increase our pressures and temperatures even more, we get to granulites, which tend to have a lot of sillimanite to them. Sillimanite is a white fibrous crystal. It has the exact same composition as the blue bladed kyanite, but a different mineral form. So it's known as a polymorph. Unlike these other minerals here are kind of rearranging and exchanging elements between them, the kyanite and sillimanite don't necessarily need to exchange elements because they have the same elements. However, the way the elements arrange themselves into a crystal structure changes as we go from amphibolite to granulite. All right, so let's try and test our knowledge. Can we use our knowledge of metamorphic rocks to interpret the geologic history of New England? Which is a good question. So we have here a very simplified geologic map. You can see in the underlying kind of dashed lines all of the state boundaries. We've got New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island outlined here. And overlain on that are colors that represent the rocks that are at the surface of the earth. So if you were walking around on a hike through this area, these are the rocks that you would pick up. And these rocks start out with a green schist, an amphibolite, another amphibolite with a slightly different mineral assemblage, another amphibolite with, again, another mineral assemblage. And turns out it's really hard for me to write amphibolite. And then the red is a granulite. So based on these facies, what we just looked at in the metamorphic facies diagram, and based on the pattern in which we see these rocks here, what interpretations can you make about the geology of New England and how these rocks formed? So you could start out with relatively what metamorphic grades are each of these rocks. And once you have the spatial configuration of metamorphic grade figured out, how can you create a tectonic situation that matches that pattern of metamorphic grade or that pattern of pressures and temperatures? So once you have a hypothesis ready, go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so moving on. These rocks are recording the formation of Pangaea, so the supercontinent. This was during the collision of Laurentia, which was North America, with Gondwana, in the kind of late early Carboniferous, or what we might call the Mississippian. And during this time, we had these plates colliding. So there was a lot of regional pressures being exerted on this area. Those pressures continued for a while and actually rotated from north to south. So you'll notice this original collision point was up here. And as we progressed to the middle to late Carboniferous, that collision or that suture, so suture is what we call it when two continents collide and kind of sew themselves together. That suture is progressed towards the south, right? And then we see it progressing even further to the south in the Permian to form the Alleghenian Range. And this dynamic regional metamorphism is going to cause the metamorphic rocks that we just looked at in New England. So as those pressures and temperatures increase, they're going to be greatest at the center of that collision and less great further away from the collision. And so that is where we get kind of this symmetric metamorphism or metamorphic grades in New England, where in the center we have really high metamorphic grades, and it moves out to lower and lower metamorphic grades as you move away from the center of the collision. All right. So to wrap up, let's go back to our original question of what is the difference in the histories of these two rocks, this black rock and this green rock. And we talked about textures and we talked about composition so far. Now I'd like you to use that to interpret the history and to reflect on the 3 stages of your answers. So for your homework, I want you to turn in your 3 stages of answers, thinking about what you initially hypothesized as the difference between the 2 rocks, how that hypothesis changed after you learned about texture, and how it changed after you learned about composition. After that reflection, I'd like you to just summarize what your interpretation is of the rock's history. Start from the parent material, the pressure and temperature conditions that formed it, to its final stage as the metamorphic rocks that were pictured. All right, that's the end of our metamorphic rocks lecture.